Firstly, thanks to the organisers for the opportunity to be involved in the conversation this evening. A really great thing. And I think Richard made a really good point that for those of us who've been around a while, we would recall that International Day used to be a big thing and sort of faded for a while, and it's really good to get it back on the agenda. So congratulations and thank you to the organisers. A challenge, I think, a fairly short sort of 5 to 10 minute speaking opportunity and probably 3 hours worth of stuff that we want to cram in, and I think that applies to all of us. And I'd just acknowledge Sam's efforts to really bring together quite tightly some really useful insights there, particularly from a policy perspective. My angle is obviously going to be a little bit different from an organisational perspective and also from a personal perspective. I wanted to do a couple of things. Firstly, perhaps ground the conversation a little bit as to why we're here, and I'll go to that in a minute. And then secondly, talk briefly about Red Cross and what it does and why it's involved in a conversation like this, but also more particularly about a few initiatives and activities that we've been working on over the last little while, both independently and also in partnership with a number of organisations around the room or represented around the room. So that's where I am to head. And a few slides just to keep the thing ticking along. Sam made mention of, there are a lot of us in the room who are nodding in furious agreement and a sense of preaching to the converted. Well, when the events actually happen, these are the sort of people that a lot of us have to talk to and deal with. And I also say this from a somewhat arm's length removed perspective as well. As the national manager of what we do in Red Cross, I'm not often out in the field faced with this gentleman or his kind or people who've experienced what he's been through. And I use this as a timely reminder with my team whenever we're doing strategic development and all the rest of it in our own policies and practices. This is what it's all about. At the end of the day, this is why we're all involved in the business that we're involved in. It's a gentleman who has unfortunately been through the Black Saturday bushfires. He's in King Lake and he's standing at the front of what was his home or his family's home. I love the look in his eye because it's really, I think, challenging all of us involved in this business. What can you do for me? How can you help me? How can you support me? But at the same time, there's a sort of an edge to his appearance, and maybe I'm reading too much into it, but my sense is there's also a grit and determination that I'm going to get on with it and I'm going to beat this thing. But I'm also looking to you guys for a bit of guidance and advice. And frankly, he doesn't care if I come from the state government, where I've worked in the past, from Red Cross, from St Vincent de Paul, from the Bushfire Brigade. He needs some support to deal with what he's faced with right here, right now. And that's what he's on about. And I think it's a useful reminder of the purpose of these sorts of events. Oops, going backwards. So very briefly, and with apologies if I'm again preaching to the converted, but the impacts that we see from disasters are many and broad, and I'm sure many of you who lived through the experiences here in Canberra in varying different ways 10 or more years ago now have shared some of that experience, whether it be your own personal experience or those of your neighbours and your community members. That's really what we're on about. And I just highlight the couple of points at the bottom there. No two people experience the same disaster. Fairly self-evident, but worth highlighting, I think. And the last one in particular, the consequences can be long, complex and disruptive. And again, with apologies to people in the room who I know have lived this experience very much over a period of time and worked with it as well. So, Red Cross, what are we on about? Very briefly. We're working with individuals and communities to cope with and manage the impact of emergencies. Significant organisational change about 8 to 10 years ago, where we had dealt too often with people in the evacuation centres who'd had this awful experience and were faced with this daunting task. We would work with them and support them for a week or two, then we'd be out of there. That was essentially our remit. We took a very deliberate strategic decision to want to actually engage more broadly, drawing on the international experience that we have in dealing with disaster on an everyday basis, as Catherine alluded to earlier in the piece. So we took a deliberate shift from just dealing with the impacts to trying to support people to be better prepared and commit to supporting them in the longer term afterwards. To that end, some strategic outcomes we look at essentially focused on preparing, responding or dealing with the events that happen and longer term recovery and that support. But in addition to that, we also take it upon ourselves to share our experiences, our lessons, our observations, things we might have done that have worked well, but equally things that haven't gone so well, to share those with people like Sam, to share them with people like the CRC, to help and contribute to that knowledge and its expansion. So, to focus a little bit on a few things that I think might be of interest to people that we've been working on. Firstly, adaptive capacities. Some colleagues of mine have been working on our preparedness work and really giving thought to what it is that we want to provide people or support people to gather for themselves that will enable them to better deal with these events when they unfortunately sometimes inevitably happen. We've come up with 4 key areas that we think are really worth attention and to which our preparedness work really focuses. People's well-being, their connection, their sense of security and their knowledge of what goes on around them. You'll find all of that in the various plans and planning processes that different organisations work through with communities. This is another angle on it, but we think it's an important thing that characterises what can in fact lead to resilience, the buzzword that seems to be out there and is getting a lot of airtime. With that in mind, we run a preparedness program, a thing we call Ready Plan. Very deliberately aims to complement the work of the numerous hazard agencies who do this stuff really well around bushfire, around flood, around cyclone, etc. Our sense a number of years ago was there was a little bit of a gap, not a huge one, but an opportunity to become a bit more involved and support the work at the more household level. First 3 steps there, fairly self-evident. Information, planning, having a kit of stuff that you'll do something with when the disaster occurs, if it does. The 4th one we think is a little bit different and critical. Knowing your neighbours. Do we know our neighbours in this day and age? Canberra community, perhaps people know each other a little bit better than some of the larger capital cities. I'm not so sure. I'm sure we've all got stories of people who live up the street who have lived there for years. We've lived where we do for years, but we actually don't have a greater connection with them. We're not asking that you be best pals, but we are promoting the concept that if something is happening, the first person liable to be there to provide support in those first hours, even days, is going to be the person who lives next door to you, or vice versa. They're going to be the one who needs your help. That's a key plank of our preparedness work. There was mention of a business roundtable that we've been involved in, working with a number of large corporate organisations, and if you have a look at the list there, it's an unusual combination of organisations. Came about best part of 2 years ago now. We kicked the thing off with a meeting of the CEOs of each of those organisations in December 2 years ago. It's essentially the brainchild, I'd have to say, of IAG, Insurance Australia Group, whose CEO had some very, I guess, what's the word? Unsettling experience going out into the field after Black Saturday, in that he, like myself, was put in the field, out of the office, into that experience where you're faced with the actual aftermath of the disaster and the reality of the things that happen and the experiences people go through. And Mike, to his credit, has taken that and really seized it and brought together some of these really good large corporate organisations together with ourselves, providing a humanitarian angle on things to really try and drive some change, to promote and support the sort of work that the Productivity Commission is doing, to really focus energies, particularly from some organisations with clearly a key interest in this, on rather than dealing with the aftermath after the awful things have happened to people, moving the emphasis from a funding perspective in particular ahead of the event. One of the great outcomes or contributed to by the Business Roundtable is the actual establishment of that Productivity Commission that Sam mentioned earlier. We're very supportive of the work that they're doing. The group got together and had some consultants put together a really good, useful report that highlighted the potential saving from an economic perspective, but also from a very human perspective, of emphasising and putting effort into before the event as opposed to the expenditure that we already see post-disaster. Really strong evidence-based research that highlights not only the human benefits, but also the economic benefits and the broader benefits to the community. A really important piece of work, and the draft Productivity Commission findings, I think, really reflect some of that very nicely. We're very supportive of those findings, but equally we will remain engaged and we'll get involved in some of the conversations as they progress from here. Other recent developments, the Productivity Commission I've mentioned, and just finally, to round things off, a couple of weeks ago, late September in fact, we ran I think it was the third of our preparedness weeks, with again very much a focus on trying to support people to be better prepared, better able to deal with the disaster if and when it happens, as opposed to having to be there, picking up the pieces, mobilising the volunteers to be in places like evacuation centres. Clearly that's a core part of our business and something we will continue to do and continue to see as a critical role to do. But ideally, people either don't get to that situation in the first place, or if they do, they're better prepared to deal with the impacts and in particular the longer term recovery from the experience that they go through.